Professor Camilla Naidu, Executive Dean, Faculty of Humanities. Professor Luke Sinwell, our inductee today. Professor Marcel Dawson, Associate Professor of Sociology, Gender Studies and Criminology at the University of Otago in New Zealand. Senior leaders of the university, members of Senate and other academics, distinguished guests and students who are present, and all those who are joining us online. Good evening, Sanibonani, Thobela, Kuyanan. It is indeed a great honor and a special privilege for me to welcome you to the Professorial Inauguration of Professor Luke Sinwell. As I do so, I wish to express a warm welcome to his loved ones, special guests, and colleagues. This is indeed a proud and joyful, yet a landmark moment for all of you, for Professor Sinwell, for us here at UJ, for higher education in South Africa and beyond. The inauguration of professors is a public ceremony in which newly appointed professors are inducted into office by the Vice Chancellor and deliver their inaugural address. The ceremony has its roots in medieval university and serves multiple purposes. First, it is an expression of welcome and an entry for new professors joining the circle of colleagues who are already professors. Secondly, it provides a platform for professors to display their expertise in the discipline and showcase their research. In the tradition subscribed to by many universities, assuming the role of the professor refers to the gown and the cap, which you see here. Once we have listened to the inaugural address, the gown denoting the professorship will formally be assumed. Today we gather to witness Professor Sinwell's entry into the illustrious community of scholars at our university. It celebrates his contribution to the discipline and ultimately his impact on society. Professors provide a university with its identity, character, academic legitimacy, and integrity. The inaugural lecture is a rite of passage following the confirmation of the appointment of a person as a professor. This evening, we will listen to Professor Luke Sinwell as the gown goes to town. By this, I mean that the power of the inaugural address is when the expertise is showcased beyond the corridors of the university and reverberates in society. It stands out as a moment of pride for the incumbent, the friends, the family, fellow scholars, the university, and ultimately society. In the past, philosophers and scholars have defined universities using very narrow conceptualizations. For example, the search for truth, the search for universal knowledge, and even as instruments serving the purpose of the economy or being utilitarian in nature. Through our work and research at UJ, I hope that we can break out of these narrow conceptualizations and reflect on the university as contributing to the public good, working towards societal impact. What then is the role of the intellectual? Edward Said, in one of his articles, defines the role of the intellectual as one who commands a vast knowledge of a specific discipline, and or two, one who is rigorous in the analysis of literature, and or three, one who views being an intellectual as a vocation or a calling, and lastly, one who functions as a kind of public memory to recall what is forgotten or ignored, to make the connections that are otherwise hidden, and to provide alternatives for mistaken policies. It remains then for us, as a university with a Pan-African vision, to derive our mandate as intellectuals and as professors, and importantly, how do we embrace the role of a professor as a disruptor while continuing to be flagship careers of our discipline? This evening, we will listen to Professor Luke Sinwell as one further step in the journey of being a professor. This is a journey which does not conclude once this lecture has been given. Notwithstanding, this inaugural lecture does create an opportunity for a self-reflective pause in the journey of the professor. Let me now invite the Executive Dean, Professor Camilla Naidoo, to introduce Professor Luke Sinwell. Thank you.
Good evening, Sanibonani, Dumelang, Goeienaand. Vice-Chancellor Functionary, Dr. Mpoti Ralipata, Prof. Luke Sinwell, friends and family of Luke Sinwell, discussant Prof. Marcel Dawson, fellow academics and guests. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our audience to Prof. Luke Sinwell. I will read some extracts from his biography. Professor Luke Sinwell completed his PhD in Development Studies at the University of Witwatersrand in 2009, after spending a number of years as a postdoctoral fellow and senior researcher at the South African Research Chair in Social Change at the University of Johannesburg. He joined the Sociology Department as a full-time lecturer in 2018. Over the last 20 years, Luke has been involved in and led a range of oral history projects with grassroots movements, including, for example, in Marikana in the Northwest Province, which resulted in an ethnography called The Spirit of Marikana, The Rise of Insurgent Trade Unionism in South Africa, published by Pluto Press in 2016 and Wits Press in 2016. Luke has published with local book presses, including Wits University Press and HSRC Press, and internationally with Routledge, Haymarket Press, Ohio University Press, and Z Books. He supervises MA and PhD students in the Sociology Department here at UJ, focusing on such areas as women's activism in social media, labor value, and teaching and learning at higher education institutions in a post-COVID world, and repression and resistance in contemporary Zimbabwe. Luke coordinates the Social Impact Assessment module, which runs as a diploma and is part of the Sociology MA program at UJ, and teaches urban sociology and globalization, amongst others. His modules introduce a radical political economy approach and seeks to understand human and environmental crises and project assessments and experiences through the lens of ordinary people who tend to be excluded from formal democratic processes. A former General Secretary of the South African Sociological Association, Luke's latest book, The Participation Paradox Between Bottom-Up and Top-Down Development in South Africa, was published by McGill Queen's University Press in their series called Protest, Power, and Resistance, published in 2023, and was subsequently also published by UJ Press. His forthcoming book, to be published in 2025, is entitled God is a Gangster. The authorized, I hope I pronounced it right, God is a Gangster. The authorized biography of Ayanda Mabulu, to be published by Jakarta Media next year. We cannot wait to read that book. So congratulations to Luke, and so thank you, Ngiyabonga, Let's welcome Prof. Luke Sinwell with a round of applause.
So I think this will catch my voice. I was excited when I was invited to give this lecture, since no one's asked me to present my research since I published on the Marikana massacre. But I just wanted to thank you all for being here. And then my mom is online. So yeah, thank you, Mom, Elizabeth Harubin Sinwell. I think you're watching, and thanks for everything. And then just Prof. Camilla, Prof. Tina, Prof. Pragna for building a foundation for a sociology department that one could only dream to be part of, and to Prof. Malahoko for carrying the torch. But the views presented in this lecture do not necessarily reflect the view of the department, nor the view of the University of Johannesburg. According to the Collins English Dictionary, striking at the heart attacks or conflicts with the basic elements or principles of that same thing. A second definition indicates that it induces fire within or ignites the spirit of the people. The idea of striking at the heart is highly politicized and imbued with discourse and ideology. It can either serve to repress the aspirations of the people or to liberate us from oppressive systems of power. I highlight what Scott referred to as the weapons of the weak, which are rarely intended to be seen by those who fall outside of the discursive domain of grassroots resistance. According to Scott, the subculture created in the slave quarter was normally hidden from the master's view. Forms of resistance may be so deeply rooted in the hearts of ordinary people that they are silent or unrecognizable on the surface and in the public domain. So this suggests that we need to unpack not so much what people do say, but what they don't. The silence rather than the spoken. I'm the grand student of the historian Philip Bonner, may his soul rest in peace. I was Newer's first PhD student, and if I'm not mistaken, Newer was Philip Bonner's first student. And now the line continues, Pontarelli, Mutekwe, and soon Mutisi, Mashaba, and Phyllis. I had no idea when I joined WITS in 2004 of the profound transformations that had occurred since the 1970s in the sphere of public history and activism, themes which have become increasingly significant to me over the last 20 years. It took time for me to see that writing stories in the name of the people can oppress as much as they can liberate. A case in point is the World Bank's Voices of the Poor, Can Anyone Hear Us?, which involved major research projects in 23 countries, including material gathered from 60,000 so-called poor people, and it informed the World Bank Development Report of 2000-2001 on poverty and development. It made heartfelt calls for all development institutions to pay closer attention to the planet's marginalized classes, especially indigenous people in the global South. And the World Bank argued that for development to be successful, the poor must be heard, but they should not seek to challenge the hegemonic racist capitalist order. The underlying argument of the participation paradox, thanks UJ Press, sounds familiar. We are democratic, speak up and be recognized, but only go so far. Challenging great man approaches to understanding the past. The history workshop at WITS, founded in 1977, was part of the international movement to build counter-hegemonic histories According to Lissoni et al., these social historians were driven by an underlying ethical and political commitment to retrieve the hidden lives of ordinary people and simultaneously to affirm the latter's agency in the making of their own histories. While space opened up for people's histories to flourish in '94, these tended to exclude women and to foreground prominent male leaders like Nelson Mandela. Alongside massification and corporatization, public histories oriented to popular struggles were diminishing, but the idea of public history gained traction internationally in the 2010s, in part as a response to movements such as Black Lives Matter. Calls were made to erode Eurocentric hegemony, decolonize knowledge, and advance epistemic justice. In their opening chapter to Archives of Times Past, Cross et al. Recently pointed out that public discussions about the history of Southern Africa before the colonial era are taking place more openly than any time in the last 100 years. Indigenous knowledge and people's histories, which were once relegated to the margins of academia, are now granted a certain degree of legitimacy. In the late 1960s, demonstrations led mainly by African Americans struck at the heart of US universities demanding civil rights and an end to the Vietnam War, while the Black Power movement took hold. Some sought integration and recognition in the university system, while others drove home a Black nationalist or socialist approach. San Francisco State College, for example, witnessed a historic 5-month strike from late 1968, raising demands including the creation of a Black Studies department. Black Studies, it appeared, would align with a public historical and sociological commitment to serve the disenfranchised and build movements to transform the structure of the capitalist economy. Like the apartheid government, which delayed democratic rule until white monopoly capital was all but guaranteed, management delayed the creation of Black Studies programs, not because they feared the integration of African American texts, lecturers, professors, or trustees, or the metaphor of decolonization, but because they wished to dull the ideological persuasion of students aligned with the Black Power and internationalist movement. According to Ibram Rogers, PhD at Temple University, they purposely stalled the institutionalization of Black Studies because they were scared of its revolutionary sentiments. Fabio Rojas' book, From Black Power to Black Studies, is perhaps instructive. It reveals how radical politics are assimilated into the university system. In Panthers Can't Save Us Now, Cedric Robinson demonstrates how the Black Power movement evolved into an elite-driven ethnic politics, which ultimately negated and transcended the revolutionary potential implied in calls for Black self-determination and socialist revolution. And Black Power delivered official recognition, he says. A toxic form of identity politics now rules the roost, offering a discourse through which to supercharge economic and political elites. So instead of building organization dedicated to confronting capitalism and white supremacy, we witness the incorporation of seemingly radical Black representations on billboards, in corporate advertisements, and through renaming of streets and hiring of Black faces in high places. The so-called decolonial turn has occurred alongside the growth in public history internationally, opening up new possibilities for cementing relationships between public history and emancipatory politics. Fees Must Fall resulted, for example, in the institutionalization of the drive to decolonize epistemology. Instead of Marx and Engels, one can enhance their performance if he or she assigns Biko Fanon Du Bois or Linda Smith. As demonstrated in the participation paradox, concepts change over time to suit various social and ideological outcomes. The World Bank and IMF responded strategically in the context of Fanon Rodney, Frere, Angela Davis, and the Black Panthers. Instead of people's power to reclaim indigenous resources from the depths of white colonialist pockets, we got people's participation in the capitalist economy. Tuck and Yang's seminal criticism of the decolonial turn argued that when metaphor invades decolonization, it kills the very possibility of decolonization. It recenters whiteness, it resettles theory, it extends innocence to the settler, it entertains a settler future. The easy absorption, she says, they say, adoption and transposing of decolonization is yet another form of settler appropriation. What if a concept's entrance into the lecture halls of academia is the sign, the ultimate sign of the domestication of that very concept? When I stepped foot in Alexandra Township, where I did my PhD research, I had tunnel vision. I ignored that social movements in post-apartheid South Africa 10 years after liberation were declining. Like many who witnessed the police repression from Cape Town to Kaya Sands, I created in my own mind a binary between the state and social movements, oppressor and liberator. I assumed that the poor, this is a quote from Ashwin Desai, that the poor somehow are an embodiment of the truth, and as long as they organize democratically, the line of march that they will advance will enhance the cause of freedom. I later realized, however, that instead of challenging underlying systems of oppression, the occupation of RDP houses maintained the neoliberal status quo. They were zero-sum. A gain by one led to the loss of another. I argued that there's a sharp disjuncture between the ideologies manufactured by academics and the worldviews that the working class possess. At UJ, I worked with a group of lefties sympathetic to social movements, including Kate Alexander, Ashwin Desai, Claire Cerruti, Mosa Padi, and Trevor Ngwane. Marcel Dawson and I debated the relationship between scholarship and activism and encountered the claim, which has yet to be disproven, that becoming an academic to support social movements is akin to launching a space program to develop a pen that writes upside down. At best, it is a circuitous route that is surely not the most efficient way of achieving your goal. To a significant extent, we misunderstood what was in people's hearts and minds, imposing abstract theories like socialism, Marxism, and Fanon. A key thread of my work suggests that scholars and activists create false binaries which do not capture the reality of ordinary people. But when the killing of 34 mine workers took place in Marikana, my emphasis shifted from communities to workplaces, and I had a crash course in labor relations, industrial action, protected and unprotected strikes, and my teachers were the surviving miners of Marikana. Our arrival 2 days after the killing of 34 mine workers at the third largest platinum mine in the world points me to Alessandro Portelli's classic, What Makes Oral History Different, whereby he suggests that the narrator is now pulled into the narrative and becomes a part of the story. Television images portrayed the mine workers as bloodthirsty, and as being on the attack, but we learned a different story directly from the workers who survived. We also saw children made fatherless and later motherless when widows chose employment at the mine over starvation, leaving their sons and daughters behind. I spent the next 2 years in the Platinum Belt with Sipiwe Mbata, who arrived in Marikana the day after the massacre and went and spent the night with the miners in their shacks. A coordinator of the Tembelithle Crisis Committee, he proved an exceptional researcher who had like a natural inclination to build and maintain trust with people. We needed to be patient and we waited just to talk to people. We befriended mine workers cooked with them, slept in their RDP houses. We drove with them. We had informal conversations. We listened to speeches at mass meetings, and we visited them while they were in jail on trumped-up charges of public violence. On 16 August 2013, 20,000 workers commemorated the Marikana massacre for the first time. I recall searching for Sipiwe, but I couldn't find him. And we hadn't been working together long, so I wondered what was up. That I was more annoyed than worried tells you something either about how comfortable Sipiwe was on his own, or perhaps it tells about the inhumanity that can underpin a research endeavor. He will tell you. There were 15 missed calls. I thought to myself, this guy is not serious. An hour later we met. Where were you the whole time, I asked. He was amidst the workers, but could not answer for fear of being seen as an informer. The workers engaged in a reflection, reenacting aspects of the strike, and many spent the night on the mountain holding a vigil. 30 workers, or 29 plus Sipiwe, crouched down as if they were again under the attack by the police, but this time they were not. And instead of carrying machetes and spears, they carried harmless sticks as symbols of resistance. At the center of their prayer was a man who had become an icon of the struggle in Marikana, the man in the green blanket, or Mambush, Mr. Noki. As the workers moved forward, one stopped and spoke about a recurring dream in which Mambush would ask him, have we got what we've been fighting for, the 12,500? The workers responded, no, we didn't. Then Mambush took some soil from the ground, threw it into the air, and vanished. And this perhaps foreshadowed what was to come. Sipiwe and I briefly, with one of the Democratic left activists, Becky Buthelezi, in his spare room in the RDP settlement Siraleng, another mining community. We stayed with him. His closest comrade was Makanya, who was arguably the foremost leader in the Platinum Belt at the time. During the 2014 5-month strike, which was the longest in South African mining history, the no work, no pay policy meant that people were hungry. But we woke up in the morning for breakfast, 2 eggs each and bread. We wanted the strike to continue and for the workers to win, but we also wanted to do interviews. Makanya told me, you are distracting us. You take leaders away with your recorder, but we have things to do. We are in the middle of a strike. 2 years later, The Spirit of Marikana was published. The strike was over, but lived in the hearts of many. The same Makanya told me, all of us need to read this, Luke. It will make a mine worker cry. In 2015, the Marikana Commission of Inquiry report was released. Its language homogenized mine workers into a mob intent on using violence and intimidation, a gross oversimplification, given that, as the evidence indicates, the vast majority acted peacefully and simply wished to speak with their employer. The suggestion that workers needed to be killed since they were militant points to a common theme, that those resisting were irrational and driven by a need for self-destruction, even suicide. The National Union of Mine Workers, which had become, in the eyes of many workers, the National Union of Management, opposed the strike action when workers were still on strike. 4 days after the massacre, Friends Baleni, NUM General Secretary, indicated that there are those dark forces who can mislead our members, make them to believe that they've got extra power to make their life different. They are as dangerous as the enemy. Baleni's reference to dark forces who organize for radical change reminded me of those who demonized the teenage Xhosa prophet who allegedly destroyed an entire nation, Nongqawuse. They blamed the people who supposedly want too much, too soon, though Neville Alexander reminds us, enough is as good as a feast. The message is clear. You must wait, as with the so-called housing waiting list, until your turn for a seat, but what they don't tell you is that We're all on the Titanic. Adam Ashforth's 1991 article, The Politics of Memory, indicates that a political parable can be found in the telling of the Nongqawuse story. Beware, the parable says, of bearers of simple solutions. Careful reasoning and testing of the evidence is required before acting on grand schemes of salvation. So I suggest that failure to gaze at the cattle killings through the eyes of the believers in Nongqawuse is equivalent to counting on the narratives of the state to explain the massacre at Marikana when police used automatic weapons capable of shooting 600 rounds of ammunition per minute. It's equivalent to the Israeli military forces only telling the story of the occupation in Palestine. We need to know from the point of view of the victims and the protagonists who are struggling. Like Chigumadzi's These Bones Will Rise Again, this is the story of a grandmother and mother of the nation, but it is not one that you'll be familiar with. It is one which you'll be hesitant to believe and which you might rather forget, because of the raw language and culture from which she emerged in her own shebeen, for it all started in a shebeen. She reignites a debate on the erasure of people's culture and the meaning of a critical series of events in Southern Africa, the cattle killings. This highlights how the drive towards decoloniality, which supposedly defends indigenous people from the gaze of westernization, silences their voice. In April 1856, Nongqawuse was spoken to at the east of the Great Kai River by two strangers who were believed were her ancestors. The message that they gave her, and which she passed on to the people, was that the Xhosa should slaughter all of their cattle and destroy all of their crops. The dead will arise, chasing the white man into the sea, and all shall live in abundance. The so-called believers in the prophecy did as instructed in a bid to save themselves from the deathly destruction of colonization, while the Xhosa non-believers refused to do so. By the following year, tens of thousands died of starvation, which paved the way for cheap black labor to serve white supremacy and racial capitalism at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. Jeffrey Pierre's Dead Will Arise is indispensable, but his narrative blames the victims, those who dared to believe in the power of the ancestors. His book begins with a poem of how Nongqawuse told lies to the people, challenging what he called the binary between the colonial story, the chief's plot, and the plot of Sir George Grey, who the Xhosa blamed. Pierre's claims to provide a more objective explanation, but instead of seeking to understand the Xhosa on their own terms, he suggests that they committed suicide or self-destructed. Achille Mbembe's article, Nongqawuse's Syndrome, was even more scathing. He says, and I quote, "The darkest brew of South African culture is its addiction to prophecy." Comparing President Zuma to Nongqawuse, a false messiah, the Xhosa aunts, aunties, grannies, and grandfathers must be turning in their graves. According to Mbembe, they had, like the mine workers, an obscure desire for suicide. J.J. Klass's recent book encounters, also with UJ Press, encounters this view, suggesting that the story of Nongqawuse is a very successful lie, thus writing out the history of the believers that the colonialists also sought to eradicate. He argues, and I quote, "The promotion of the distorted narrative of Nongqawuse became a convenient historical exercise to exonerate the British who engineered the lung disease as a successful biological weapon of mass cattle destruction, proposing what he describes as a decolonial alternative. Triangle of 100 Years Wars, his book, challenges the assumption that the Xhosa would be unwise or stupid enough to kill their own cattle. instead of being blamed for their own destruction, for it is often said that the Xhosa people committed suicide in their allegedly illogical, premature, and too militant struggle against colonialism. This revised history suggests that their belief systems never even existed, thus negating culture and oral tradition. Adam Ashforth's comments in 1991 resonate. I find myself somewhat uncomfortable with the notion that a good academic training and a period of archival research is enough to authorize a refutation of a whole people's understanding of their own past. God is Gangsta. The authorized biography of Ayanda Mabulu tells the story of the healer, the seer, the prophetess, Nongwawuse, through the eyes of Ayanda, whose worldview is rooted in the experience of his grandmother and mother. May their souls rest in peace. Unlike Nahanda, popular perception tends to demonize Nongwawuse. Considered a monster with a contaminated womb, many believe that she offered her body to Sir George Grey and the colonialists, and thereafter lied to the people who she convinced to destroy their cattle and crops, and then eventually starve. Nongwawuse became Adam's Eve in the story of original sin. Work for us, read from our Bible, use the coin, and you shall find the light that you seek, the people were told. That which is not white and Western shall be no more. But there was something else, perhaps. Colonialists feared the power of independent women untied to the sexual division of labor under capitalism. Sylvia Federici's description of witches hunting appears instructive. The attack on women, she argues, comes above all from capital's need to destroy what it cannot control and degrade what it needs most for its reproduction. The internal, silent workings of the mind and spirit of the grandmother in her kitchen turned bedroom and business, as Sherbine tells a different story. Abantu Bomlambu, the people of the waters, came out of the water to explain that the Xhosa must kill our cattle and burn our crops so that the ancestors returned and chase the poison of whiteness, which Ayanda paints and which few can bear to cast a glance at. Nongwawuse then was a truth teller who would save their way of life from the colonizers. The British could not defeat the people through military force, so they went to their hearts, the belief systems, and their culture. And overnight, instead of blackness being associated with godliness and invention, we became dark, dirty, and worthless, backwards, amankaba. It became widely believed that the people had fooled themselves by supposedly taking the easy way out and that they needed to be saved by whiteness. The call to produce academic work in dialogue with the people is not an academic call, but an ethical one opposed to extraction. The story of the cattle killing disrupts the simplistic binary between Western and indigenous ways of knowing. Unraveling that which is hidden is also not enough, for it assumes that once we know, the transcripts of the downtrodden will somehow lead us to our salvation. And yet the idea of the pure revolutionary subject arguably remains in vogue. We must confront the truth within ourselves, and then our answer might become clearer when one asks, why is a white man writing your biography? We all inhabit contradictory locations, not least because of our diverse identities as scholars. For all good sociologists are aspiring historians. Painting, sculptures, music, literature, the arts are the repository of society's collective memory. Writing is not sacrosanct, nor are scholars the most important ones who tell histories. We are leaps behind the true sense of humanity that lives within those whose histories we write. Song sung to the child as he sits against the grandmother's breast, written in prose, painting on canvas is art, where you will find the people's heart. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and a very warm congratulations to you, Professor Luke Sinwell. I'm coming to you from an unseasonably cold Dunedin in the South Island of Aotearoa, New Zealand, and I really wish I could have been there to respond in real time and to celebrate with Luke, but c'est la vie. What an honor it is to have been invited to say a few words on this auspicious occasion. Of course, it was always going to be a risk to record my input a couple of weeks before the lecture is due to take place, because in that time, Luke could have changed his talk entirely and I would end up sounding like that crazy woman who's beamed in from Middle Earth. But anyway, I'll forge ahead. So when Luke extended this invitation to me to be the respondent for his inaugural professorial lecture, he said it seemed fitting because I had recruited him to join the University of Johannesburg 15 years ago. And I thought, there's no way that happened 15 years ago. And so I went back, had a look, and I was right. In fact, it happened 16 years ago. And it was in 2008 that Luke officially accepted a position to work at UJ. And he began what is now a very illustrious career early in the following year. Time is quite a funny thing. In some ways, it feels like just yesterday that I met Luke at Bean There Cafe in Melville. But then things happen. I'm reminded of how much time has in fact passed. For instance, when I met Luke, I had monochrome black hair and 20/20 vision. And in that same time, Luke has gone on to do incredible things. As many of you know, his CV offers a dazzling record of his achievements and trajectory from postdoctoral fellow to full professor over the last 15 years. As newly minted PhD graduates in 2008, 2009, Luke and I shared an interest in collective action and grassroots struggle. We worked on a couple of projects together, grappling, as many before us did, with how ordinary people make change from below. And in the course of this work, Luke and I became acutely aware of our different practices as social movement researchers. And I've always admired Luke's ability to walk very comfortably in the world of the academy and the much bigger worlds beyond it. A word that comes to mind, and one that I've used on multiple occasions in reference letters for Luke, is intrepid. Luke, while you are still that same courageous researcher that I met 16 years ago, I get the sense that you're far more reflective about your research practice today, even more so than when we co-authored our piece on the ethical and political challenges of participatory action research. In reading the script for your inaugural professorial lecture, I see someone who reflects very deeply on how and why their thinking has changed over time. And although I've never sat in on one of your lectures, I have no doubt that your honesty and openness about the blind spots in your practice make you an excellent teacher. You go beyond research-led teaching to think about and even say out loud how you got things wrong. Of course, there is vulnerability in admitting one's shortcomings, and as many of you know, the Academy is not necessarily a place that allows us to make mistakes, let alone own them and learn from them, which is rather ironic given that it is meant to be an institution of higher learning. Increasingly, however, it is a place that wants answers, blueprints, and patents that rely on best practice and that awful word, benchmarking. Now, what I enjoy about Professor Sinwell's reflexive practice is that it compels us to ask questions rather than giving us glib answers. I want to reflect briefly on Luke's lecture where he discusses the reenactment a year later of the atrocity that occurred at Marikana in 2012, the recurring dream in which Mambush appears and then vanishes, and also the revisiting of the cattle killings. The way that Luke examines these processes of going back to understand how we can move forward reminds me of a Māori proverb that has become very influential in my own teaching and more recent research. Translated, the proverb suggests that we walk backwards into the future with our eyes fixed on the past. Luke's more recent work underscores this proverb quite nicely. His research has shifted away from ethnographies of collective action in the past and present towards co-creating more hopeful futures through an appreciation that time does not always have to be understood as linear. Luke, although you haven't specifically identified your theoretical approach as Afrofuturism, neither in the draft version of your lecture that I read nor in your forthcoming monograph, I'm suggesting that Afrofuturism is what grounds your work. Although we don't communicate often and we're no longer working in the same geopolitical context, it's almost as though our thinking has been shifting ahead on parallel tracks. In my own more recent work that has also moved a little bit away from the study of social movements to a consideration of alternative futures, I'm just beginning to appreciate the value of what the Portuguese sociologist Boaventura de Sousa Santos calls ecology of knowledges and what I have termed kaleidoscopic thinking. I intentionally use the word or the metaphor of a kaleidoscope because it invokes childhood memories of being absolutely captivated, not only by the amazing colors, but also by the infinity of patterns that one could see by adjusting the lens or adjusting the dial just a little bit. By incorporating artistic representations, indigenous ways of seeing, oral histories, and mythology alongside dominant understandings of the world, we give ourselves an opportunity to experience that childhood fascination once again. By casting new, more complex lenses on the world, we begin to see top-down narratives that are warped by racial capitalism and patriarchy for exactly what they are, just one way of seeing the world. Other eyes, other voices, other realities, and other representations can inject our endeavors with a youthful optimism. This is very exciting, Luke, and I wish you well with this shift in your trajectory. Before I sign off, I just want to share a personal story about Luke, not as a scholar, but rather as a friend. Luke, you may not remember this, but in 2010, we were at a conference in Gothenburg, Sweden, and one evening I was meant to meet up for a drink with my now husband, Steve Jackson. Because I wasn't so sure how the night would turn out, I asked you to be my wingman, just in case Steve ended up being a giant weirdo. And happily for me, he wasn't, but I don't think I ever thanked you or even said goodnight to you. But thanks for not lurking around for too long, lest Steve think I was the giant weirdo. So thanks a lot for that, mate. I want to end off by sharing this photo that was taken in mid-2012, just a couple of days before I left South Africa. Now, I hope you can all see that. It features some of my favorite people in the world, and if any of you are there this evening, big shout out to you. I miss you all very, very dearly. And I think what I like about this photo is that it sums up literally and also figuratively my relationship with Professor Sinwell. Luke, from where I stand, you truly are a giant. For your contributions to scholarship, your unwavering commitment to working class struggle, and the care and generosity that I know you will continue to show to your colleagues and students. Thank you. We need more people like you on the planet. You are without a doubt someone that I will always look up to. Congratulations once again on your promotion to full professor. Thanks so much, everyone. Bye-bye.
still no, it's not that bad. Congratulations. Thank you very much. I think Prof. Luke must have sensed that I'm an engineer, so he was trying to confuse me completely. But thanks very much. I actually enjoyed your lecture very much. And once again, congratulations. What is left now is for us to close the proceedings. Thanks, Prof. Camilla Naidu. Thanks, Prof. Marcel Dawson in absentia. And thanks to Bernice and the team, and to all of you who honored Luke today by attending either online or in person. Now, the reward for attending in person is that when the cameras are switched off, we go into the lounge and we enjoy some refreshments that have been prepared. But thanks very much, and once again, congratulations, Prof. Sinwell.